Welcome to History Fuzz, where we dive into the intersections of history, astronomy, and monumental landscapes. Today, we have a truly fascinating guest, Dr. Steve Gullberg. He's a professor of integrative studies at the University of Oklahoma, a retired airline captain, and a distinguished member of the International Astronomical Union, where he chairs the Astronomy and Culture Division and even serves on the Star Naming Committee. Dr. Gullberg is a pioneer in the field of archaeoastronomy, blending his deep knowledge of astronomy and archaeology to study the ancient celestial alignments of Inca sites. In this episode, he'll share his insights from his research on the effects of light and shadow during the solstices, equinoxes, and other pivotal solar events. Together, we'll explore how these monumental landscapes of the Inca operated within both temporal cycles and cosmic rhythms. So, get ready for another enlightening episode on ancient skies, sacred structures, and the celestial wisdom of the Inca.
I set out to photo document the light and shadow effects that the Incas intentionally designed in their wakas, their temples and shrines and caves. So if there was going to be something that would happen on the day of a solstice at a certain site, I wanted to photograph what was going to be, what the sun shadow was going to do and what they had intended.
Let's get right into that. You physically spent time in Peru with lights, I take it, recreating the shadows, or were you there visualizing the shadows as they happened in real time on the astronomical events?
Yeah, I went to examine 31 different sites to see if they had light and shadow effects, and most of them did. And I was not recreating anything. I had, through my research and computations that would predict when something should happen, and then I would try to be there and on the time that it was supposed to happen and photo document it taking place.
Charles Stanich and Brian Bauer described a solstial event from the island of the sun, which was framed by two pillars. Did you do any work on that set of shadows?
I did not go to Lake Titicaca where their work was. My work centered around southwestern Peru, around the heart of the Inca Empire, Cusco, and then the Sacred Valley, the Machu Picchu region, and also Tipon and Sayhuite were included. But there were 31 sites in that heart of the Inca Empire, but there certainly were other significant places in the Inca Empire, and of course, where Bauer and Stanish are talking about their creation myths had everything starting there at Lake Titicaca. So what I was looking at in the region that I studied, it all began with Lake Titicaca and what the Incas believed took place there.
In the southwest of Peru, is there any record of pre-Incan creation mythology and astronomy?
No, I haven't really seen much of anything there, again, because just like the Incas did not record in a written language, apparently their predecessors did not either. So what the Incas knew, they learned orally, and then they carried them forward orally, but there might not have been a clear distinction on what came from an earlier culture, although very definitely the Incas learned from earlier cultures. They could not have done everything they did with astronomy in the mere roughly 100 years that their period of conquest existed if they didn't already know what these astronomical cycles were. And of course, they had to learn those from cultures that came before them. So this information certainly was being transmitted throughout a vast amount of time, but it just hasn't been recorded in a way that would specifically attribute to where it might have come from.
Have you found within the 31 sites any evidence of lunar orientation to perhaps the maximum or minimum, or is it all solar?
The Incas did not ignore the moon, but there hasn't been evidence of them being interested or using major lunar standstills or minor lunar standstills, and that would be something that they would very much, if they were interested, would have to have learned from earlier cultures, because you're talking over 18 years for a single cycle, so it would take a long time for them to realize a specific repetitive pattern. Longer certainly than their period of during the conquest years existed. But of course they acknowledged the moon for sure, because the emperor himself was considered the son of the sun, and his wife the daughter of the moon. It's just that the being a solar culture, a solar cult, everything with the sun overshadowed whatever was believed of the moon, but the moon beliefs were still there, and they just kind of get overshadowed by everything with the sun and the solar culture. That was a big important thing too with the Incas, where they were, the ruling Incas were deriving their authority there from being from the sun, because the emperor was the son of the sun, and such that everything had to revolve around the sun for their legitimacy.
Could you give us an example then of some of the orientations and alignments, Stephen, within that collection of 31 sites that you surveyed? What was the most repetitive architectural format in?
Overall, before I talk about some specific examples, they were primarily interested in the June solstice sunrise and the December solstice sunrise. There was also some interest in the sunsets on those dates. There's more disputed interest in the equinox sunrises and sunsets, but then that a lot of that is because while a solstice is very identifiable, because the sun is moving on the horizon and it stops, and then it turns around and goes back from where it came. The equinox is just quickly moving by on that date. So, and also for various reasons, something oriented east-west, it could have been for a different reason. So it could be a coincidence and wasn't intended to be astronomical at all.
How far were they displaced? How far widespread was this reverence for the solstices?
There would be examples down toward Chile, like and around Lake Titicaca. There'd be examples up north toward Ecuador, in the northern part of the empire. The solstice, like the Inti Raymi festival, was at the June solstice, and it was the biggest, most important festival of the year. Although the December solstice, Kappa Raymi, was very, very important as well. But the celebration of Inti Raymi in June would have been very prominent throughout the empire, and the festival is still celebrated in Cusco even today, but only with massive amounts of people that flood the city from other parts of the country and elsewhere.
It's like the June solstice at Stonehenge, where all the druids and the tourists turn up, and only recently a paper was released absolutely demonstrating that Stonehenge was aligned to the winter solstice sunset. So while they're there, they're exactly 6 months wrong.
Now, to talk more about East-West, one of the sites that I researched in the Sacred Valley is called Chinchero. It's a large site with a number of wakas.
Could you really describe this site for the audience who have maybe never considered what an Inca sacred landscape looks like? Let's discuss this building and the environment it's within, and what do you mean by a waka exactly?
A waka is a shrine, but basically it's the closest term that we have to it. There were just many things that the Incas considered waka to be sacred. It wasn't just something physical that It could be a rock, it could be a river, it could be a mountain. That they all had sentient life in Inca cosmology, and they all had significant influence over the people. But like for instance, when we get back to the Seques around Cusco, and there were Seques elsewhere in the empire as well. The Seques around Cusco each had many huacas, and those were more easily identifiable ones. They were smaller, so you could walk along the Seke. It wasn't necessarily a straight line; it was a crooked line, but you could follow the huacas in the Seke. Here at Chinchero, this is a large site. It's not just one rock or whatever. It's a very large site, and within it, besides some of the different carved boulders, and some of them are massive boulders, the walls that were built in there, this is what I was getting to, the walls that the Incas built in there are exactly north-south and exactly east-west. And the reason for why that happened has not really been found, but they are like the east-west walls are precisely east-west. So they we don't know for sure what method they used, but one possibility is using a gnomon with shadow casting to get basically one direction, and then you just use simple geometry to construct the other directions. But for whatever reason, they wanted those walls to be exactly north, south, east, and west. There's several of them, and they are precise.
What's interesting is, in this instance, you could normally say perhaps it wasn't the east to west they were sanctifying within the architecture, maybe it was the north to south meridian. But you can't see Polaris, you can't see the North Star from where you are, and so you're only going to see the south celestial pole, which isn't marked by a star. So you'd go back then to thinking maybe east to west was the intentionality there, or perhaps both.
And it wasn't the only, these walls, north, south, east, west, weren't the only major feature there. There were two exceptionally large huacas carved from stone, one called Titicaca, the other called Chingana. And the two of them are set at, like I said, this is a large estate, this whole Chinchero. The two were set at quite a distance from each other. Part of the curiosity there is they are so large, it would be unfathomable if they could have been moved into position, but they are on the axis of June solstice sunrise, December solstice sunset.
What's the distance between the two huacas on the solstitial alignment?
It's probably at least 300 meters.
So you can see one from the other.
You can see one from the other, but it's even as large as it is, it looks small in the distance. And as we talk in the next few minutes about when I talk about some of the other sites, that June solstice sunrise, December solstice sunset alignment is a recurring factor. And when we get to the Machu Picchu, one of the most significant places that I found comes out there.
Great. So I've got written down here, we've got finished with Chinchero, but then we've got the Seques and we've got Machu Picchu. So let's stick with Chinchero. So you've described two huacas 300 meters apart on the June sunrise and December sunset.
I'm always careful to use June and December during winter and summer because of crossing the hemispheres.
It saves you having to do a lot of explanation. And when you used that term for the first time, I thought, oh, good, he's a June December guy. Because when do you know how many messages we'll get saying we don't know what we're talking about, saying that the winter solstice is in June? However, how did the building at Chinchero fit in, or how was it associated with those two huacas? Where was it positioned?
The walls that I was talking about were basically walls holding up earth in tiers. They weren't walls of buildings, although there are buildings there that is kind of blurred now because, like in much of the empire, the Catholics came in and built after the conquest, either built new or built on top of what had previously been there. So the buildings that are there now are pretty much of Spanish construction. But these walls that I talked about, that's good that you mentioned that so I could clarify. They weren't building walls in this location. They were walls holding up earthen tiers.
So, Stephen, you must have spent a long time pondering on Who or what might have been positioned on top of those walls? What do you think? What was it used for? Function? How did it function?
I haven't been able to figure that out.
Have you speculated?
This particular site was a palace of Topa Inca, who was the son of Pachacuti, who started the period of conquest. And and when the emperors died, the sons did not inherit the father's palaces and properties. They had to start anew from scratch. And like Pachacuti's main palace, his mummy, he'd be mummified. His mummy would reside there. It would still be cared for by the attendants that took care of him while he was alive.
Hmm.
And the mummies of the Inca rulers would be consulted at different times for different things, and there were times when they would bring them out in a parade fashion through the streets, and but the sons would have to build their own palace grounds and palaces, and Pachacuti's son Topa Inca built Chinchero. So for whatever reason, there was something that he was interested in or wanted that brought about these walls, retaining walls that were north, south, east, and west.
How far away or how close are signs of inhabitation? Where did all the people live when this site was used by the nobles? Or is it within a monumentalized landscape?
The location, could have been just because it's not too far northwest of the Cusco area. So if he had to, start setting up his own properties, that it was in the neighborhood, so to speak. But getting away from Chinchero, Chinchero is not my favorite site in the empire at all. There's some others that have much more exciting light and shadow effects.
Yeah, but I'm so delighted you chose two Wakas with the solstice alignment. And that really lays out at its fundamental level what they were thinking about concerning light and, of course, shadow, perhaps as equally as important as the light.
Among the sites that I visited that became most fond of, one is called Kenko Grande, and it is on the hills that rise above Cusco, and this particular one is a very large carved limestone outcropping. And one of the effects that was carved there on top of this very large limestone outcropping, and this is so large that many people could stand up there and watch this at the same time. The cosmology of the Incas, they had, part of that was three sacred creatures. They had the condor for the world above, the puma for this world, and of course, which was common in many cultures, the serpent for the underworld, the serpent or snake. Um, on this, they carved what has been named much later the awakening of the puma. They carved two round gnomons on top of a stone platform they carved, and off in the direction of where the June solstice sun would rise, there is a crevice in the rock there, so that when the sun rises, the light comes through that crevice. It first lights one of the gnomons and the other, each casting a shadow, forming the face of a puma.
Oh, get away.
And that happens at the June solstice sunrise.
Whoa, whoa. 1 second, Stephen. Let's stop. Freeze there. Freeze on that moment. What exactly? Yeah, are you saying the gnomon has been stylized with perhaps like a little mouth, so then the shadow casted behind it's the shape of a puma's head?
The rock that the light first comes through has a crevice, so it's aimed for the light at the two gnomons, so that when they both are illuminated, the gnomons themselves are the eyes that are illuminated,
Oh my
and
goodness.
then the shadow of the ears behind them.
No, really. It's magnificent, but it makes me lament because to even to consider that aspect or whole another level of archaeoastronomy, think what's been lost just with the reshaping of hills and the cracking of rocks over time.
And then also at Kenko Grande, there another recurring feature, still on the top, is a zigzag channel, and they use those for divination primarily. They pour a liquid there. It could be water, it could be the chicha, the corn maize beer that was very prevalent. Um, and then there could be a couple of channels that would divert and help them for divination purposes. That was one of those on top of Kenko, but down inside of Kenko, there's a very nice cave with a finely carved altar in it. There is a set of ceremonial stairs in the Inca culture, because of the three worlds, the world above, this world, and the world below. There are ceremonial steps, 3 steps that are many times totally non-functional, that will have been constructed. And then here in this cave, at the time approaching the June solstice again, the sun comes through a light tube above, and illuminates first the bottom step, and then the 2 steps, and then 3 steps, and then it leans over toward the altar.
Get away.
Which lends itself very nicely to whatever ceremony that they had going on at the time.
Oh, yeah. And the weeks building up to that key moment, watching that shadow creeping.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, are there records of a formal schooling or a school where young Incas were taught these proto-sciences? There just must have been.
I'm sure they were, because they had brilliant people to set all these things up. But again, it was all oral traditions, so the records aren't there. Even the first things that were written by Spaniards, the Spanish chronicles, and they were just writing down the oral traditions they would get from interviewing the Incas who talked with them. And then, like you mentioned, quipus a little bit ago, and that's a dispute as to how much was ever recorded in quipus. It seemed to be generally agreed that they kept record of business transactions, and then where it went from there is a matter of dispute. Gary Urton, of course, he did some of the early pioneering work with that, and has written some great things. Another, again, there's so much that is not totally understood, but with the quipus, some believe that there was no standard language of quipus, that each quipumac, the person who created that quipu and kept the records, had his own system. So someone else might not be able to read what that person had recorded. But moving on from that.
No, I'd like to just add one thing on the end of the quipu chat. I always visualize the quipu. It's quite abstract, but follow me here, like where I'm from, Scotland. Every 15 miles around the coast of Scotland, the dialect and the accent changes, just like a quipu. Where if you took your quipu and went 40 miles south, it's going to almost be like an unintelligible language, but perhaps that was the key of the quipu. Nobody else could understand it, and these transactions were kept obscure.
And that's a great analogy, Ashley. I like that.
Nice one, thank you. Could have gone both ways there, It had its own accents expressed in the knots. But leaving that, please, Stephen, I'd love you to go on and talk about more of these sites. These shadow effects you're talking about are this is the first time in 25 interviews anyone's mentioned this level of astronomy. I think it's fascinating stuff.
Further up the rising terrain above Cusco, further up from Kenko Grande, is another very large limestone outcropping that's finely carved. It's called Laco, Lacco, and there are carvings all over it. But what I found most interesting, there are 3 caves within it, each that had astronomical significance. The cave on the southwest side, it was not a large cave. It was not any. Walking in there didn't look it was anything amazing, but there was a small altar, and there was a light tube that was aimed for the altar. And I was there one time where I was standing inside looking through the tube outside, and was able to photograph the crescent moon passing through the field of view that you would get from this light tube, which of course implies that light from the moon and most likely the sun would come in the other direction at specific times when it was lined up with the orientation of that tube, so that would lend itself to whatever ceremonies they were doing inside, and that's the least interesting of the three caves.
Please define what goes on in the other two.
On the northeast side of Laco is a cave, and we talked about the June solstice sunrise and how it here it'll be moving from right to left until the day of the time of the solstice. Like you said, it stands still and then it moves back again. Well, the door for this cave on the northeast side was aligned so that at the time of the June solstice, the solstice sunrise was aligned exactly with the door of the cave. So it would move, from right to left. It would stop, and then when the sun rose, it would be shining, lined up exactly with the cave door, coming in, illuminating an altar that was inside the cave, and then reflected light illuminating the rest of the cave. And the altar had direct light on it for, when I timed it when I was there, was 2 hours and 8 minutes until the last vestiges moved away.
So where is the optimum viewing spot to see that astronomical occurrence?
My research, my photographs, everything were from inside the entrance, looking outside, so I could frame the photograph with the door and then show the rising sun on the horizon.
When you use the word altar, what do you talk about exactly? Because a modern Christian altar is a square edifice at the most holy of holies in the church. What's an Inca altar, or what kind of altar is located within inside a cave waka?
They're kind of just they're carved flat surfaces on the rock that can be shaped and formed. Some of them were, more finely carved than others. And when I get to talk about the third cave, the best altar of all was in that one.
Stephen, could you please describe the last of those three caves? And then I'd like to ask you a question that encompasses all three.
The third cave at Laco is on the southeast side, and it's a multi-chamber cave, and has some very nice carvings around it. When you're walking through the entranceway into the outer chamber, there's a serpent carved on the wall for the underworld again, and of course caves would be associated with the underworld. You get into the main chamber inside. There was a mostly circular altar that had been carved. The upper surface was pretty finely surfaced. I imagine back at the time the Inca was pretty smooth. It might have eroded a little bit over the years, but above it was a light tube again.
You better describe what light tube is.
It's a tube that was intentionally carved for the most part to cast light down to something inside the cave below. The sign outside the cave is known as the Cave of the Moon. Whatever stories are behind that, there's certainly definite solar activity here, because when I first visited this cave, I took some measurements with my compass and such, and found that I said, hey, the sun is going to come through here at the time of the zenith sun. Which the zenith sun, of course, is in the tropics. The two times of year at that specific location where a vertical pole will cast no shadow at local noon, and the Incas were aware of that. But this light tube was aligned to bring light onto the altar at the time of the zenith sun. So I went back on the day of the zenith sun. One of the two. This was on October 26th, which is one of the 2 days at that latitude. And sure enough, the sunlight came through the tube, fully illuminated this altar. It could have been, used for any kind of ceremonies there, because it was just a magnificent effect that they had created. And then as the sun kept moving, the portion of the altar that was illuminated grew smaller until the sun no longer was properly coming through the tube. But this was at local noon on October 26th. So, like I said, despite the people there knowing this is the Cave of the Moon, there was certainly a very powerful solar effect that happened there as well.
It's really interesting that you described the third cave as the Cave of the Moon. I'm actually aware of that cave. It looks like it has a sort of rectangular modern altar at the back of that cave, doesn't it? What is that? There's bricking in there.
It wasn't exactly rectangular. It was a little more rounded, but it wasn't a perfect circle either. And that's the altar. If you've been there, that's the altar that I was talking about. I've got pictures of it being illuminated, pictures of me laying on it being illuminated.
So this is fantastic. Let me run this past you and just, it's not a question really, it's just I want to tell you something and then I'm going to stop and let you say something about it. On the 5th of April, it's called the Day of No Shadows. That's our zenith day.
At your latitude, yes.
It is. And that occurs beautifully on the week when there's no El Nino, on the week that the rainy season starts. And it's known that the oldest site in Colombia, pre-Moisca, 2000 BC, it's called El Infernito, a row of 54 stones aligned to the solar equinoxes. So, at midday on the 5th of April, the sun shines down, there are no shadows, and these pillars, these are all phallic pillars, and it was interpreted that the sun was seen to be inseminating the earth, and then within days of that moment, the rainwaters came. But you know what's fascinating, Stephen? On that day of the zenith, when the sun was at its directly above in the sky, they worshipped the moon goddess because she was being feminized and fertilized. I find it fascinating that inside the moon cave, the sun is allowed to fertilize
I, I like that. I like that, Ashley. I'm going to give that a lot more thought.
because it's the male inseminating the female, the womb of the moon, if you like.
That actually has some sense to it.
It's not over the woo line. It's based on a culture that's only, a degree further north in latitude in the sense of what the sun and the moon are doing. And I always thought that fascinating that it was associated with the moon because the moon goddess and the earth goddess here, our version of Pachamama, were one and the same. She transitioned from the moon to the earth.
So here, if the cave of the moon, if that name it has persisted since the time of the Inca, and I don't know if it has or not, but if it has, then that would make a lot of sense that this cave was dedicated to the moon, the daughter of the moon that was feminine, and then, like you said, being inseminated by the sun and the sun's light coming down through the light tube into the altar. There's a certain amount of sense to that.
There must have been a central temple of the moon in Inca Peru, and I've never come across anything as close as that cave. But what do you think? Do you think that was perhaps a central temple of the moon? There had to have been one.
It's close enough to Cusco where it could have been.
Hmm. So, Stephen, how do you determine between probability and chance? How do you determine what's probable and what's luck before you publish your work, Stephen? Because you've not been shot down very much. You're quite tidy.
The photo documentation helps a lot. Everything needs to be put into cultural context when we work with archaeoastronomy because different orientations, alignments can be found. They could have been for some other reason and nothing astronomical. So you have to find the context within the culture, be it the Incas or elsewhere in the world, of what they understood about astronomy, how they used astronomy, why they used astronomy, and if you can start adding that kind of support, then it becomes credible. And without cultural support, any alignments and orientations we don't can give credence to. Um, Here, with my photo documentation and everything, that's why I was doing the research that I did, was because it's kind of hard to argue if you can show that it's happening. I still needed to support it with cultural context, but there was enough known about Incas solar worship and astronomy to give me the support I needed. But by photographing these events actually happening was significant. There's a third waka in the vicinity of Kenko Grande and Laco, which is a much smaller, more obscure one. I didn't even have a name for it until I started working with a certain colleague who's from Cusco. He he'd been to the same site. He calls it Waka 44. There's it didn't get a big grand name. It's just Waka 44, but it's a small site, and there's another rock outcropping that had a number of seats that are many of them were fairly eroded over the years, but facing different directions toward the horizon.
Made from what, Stephen?
Carved into the rock. They're just carved into the rock. But the main focus of this site wasn't the seats. There are two gnomons, one large one that is maybe 2.5 to 3 feet across, and the other is smaller, about more like a foot. And sorry, I'm not thinking in the English system rather than the metric system, but they are carved into the rock bed. They weren't, planted there. They were carved there, separated by a couple of feet, and oriented such so that if you can imagine this big circle and this small circle, if you imagine a tangential line between them, that's oriented so that one of those tangential lines points to we're on the horizon to look for the June solstice sunrise, and the opposite end to the December solstice sunset. The other points to the December solstice sunrise, and the opposite, the June solstice sunset. And then, if you will, if they were interested in the equinoxes, it's aligned east and west. So the equinox sunrise and sunset are there, and of course, besides my research and in the paper published, I've got a photograph of that line pointing to the June solstice sunrise.
Are you suggesting that from the carved seats that have been embossed into the rock, when you position yourself in there, those two gnomons lie, one to the northeast, one to the northwest, and they mark the position of the sun on the horizon at the solstices?
When I was doing my own photographs and everything, I wasn't sitting. You don't need the seats, but if the seats were used at those times, it would have been probably for convenience of the whatever significant elite Incas were there.
Mummies.
Yeah, that could be too.
Do you think all of these sites worked at one time in a coordinated statewide worship? Or do you think maybe it was more localized, where local rulers visited this site for the winter solstice, this one for the summer solstice? Because what you've described seems to be less than state temples. This isn't the Goronchacha temple in Cusco, what you're describing.
No, it's not.
Can you explain how it worked? What did people do, and where did they go on this key solstice date?
These are three sites that are not far apart from one another.
Okay.
They're not constructed temples. They're just carved into rock. They were at least enhanced.
Have you ever been to a site where you expected something to happen and you got it wrong? It didn't.
Not exactly, but I went to sites where nothing happened. I went there just to validate whether this was everywhere, or there were some significant wakas that I found no astronomical relation at all. That was a valuable part of my research, showing that those sites did not have the orientations, but more did than not.
Yeah.
As I continue here throughout the region, the Sacred Valley, there's a number of sites that have lesser phenomena for the June solstice sunrise or December solstice sunrise. So let me move on toward the Machu Picchu region.
Yes, I'd like you to tell me about your recent observations relating to Machu Picchu in that area. It would be great, Stephen.
At Machu Picchu, of course, there are a number of wakas, things there that are oriented for the sun in one way or the other. What has been called the Torreon, that has a big granite boulder in the center of it, that there's a window oriented so the June solstice sunlight will come through the window and cast on the boulder. And it's also been suggested by some that the Incas were observing the heliacal rise of the Pleiades at that location as well. And when I get to Yactopata in a couple of minutes, I'll talk more about the heliacal rise of the Pleiades there. So there were other different places around Machu Picchu, and even climbing Huayna Picchu, the very iconic mountain that you see in all the pictures. But there's the Intihuatana at Machu Picchu, which it's been disputed as to whether the Incas thought this was a hitching post of the sun. But That's what it's become known as a hitching post of the sun. And the Incas were concerned, at June solstice, that's the winter solstice in the south, in the southern hemisphere, that the sun each day was crossing the sky in a lower and lower arc.
Yeah, but were they really concerned, Stephen? Because they weren't stupid either, you know?
You've got the ruling elites portraying all these things for
The theatre and the drama to raise the stakes for their
with,
followers.
with the followers. Yes,
Gotcha. How stupid of me to say they weren't stupid. You're absolutely right. They aren't stupid. They're controlling an entire empire through this stuff.
so they make this big thing out of the sun getting lower and lower, and they're going to do something to prevent it from descending below the horizon. And then, of course, after the solstice, it worked. It starts coming up again.
Tributes.
But one of the most interesting things I found at Machu Picchu, um, and it wasn't really understood until about 20 years ago when one of my doctoral supervisors, Kim Malville, with a team largely from the United Kingdom, they were looking for Yactopata, which is something that had been recorded in Hiram Bingham's logs.
What was it recorded as? What did he mention it or describe it as?
I've not read it myself,
Okay. Yeah.
but that's what led them to want to look and find this, and it had been kind of forgotten in all the years since, and they looked at his records from Yale, and they tried some different search methods, even LiDAR. They weren't finding what they wanted, but finally they had pinpointed where they thought this could be, and they climbed the Yactopata Ridge, and on the ridge, totally engulfed in the cloud forest, which is the same kind of incredibly dense jungle vegetation that you get at lower altitudes. They found over 100 structures in the cloud forest that they must have been known to the local farmers, but they'd been unknown scientifically, even to the archaeologists in Peru. The Yactopata Ridge is 5 kilometers across a gorge from Machu Picchu to the Yactopata Ridge. It's a very clear line of sight. So you can imagine that what a revelation it was that there was this huge complex of structures that should have been able to have been seen from Machu Picchu, except for they were totally engulfed by the cloud forest. When I climbed up there with some of my assistants, they were using machetes to try to hack away so I could get in to see some of these things. That's how dense it was. So this was 2003. This was 2003 when Kim was there, and then they did a lot of research and analysis, and from the Yactopata Sun Temple. Mm-hmm. And the Yactopata Sun Temple, by the way, is kept clear now. They haven't allowed that to grow over again, so that people hiking the trails in toward Machu Picchu can come by.
How big is it? Is it open air, Stephen? Please describe that Sun Temple.
It's open air, like most of the Machu Picchu structures. There's no roof right now because the original roof would have been probably thatched and is long gone.
Oh, so it was. So you are defining here a structure that had walls and a roof, rather than a plaza type platform.
The structure has multiple rooms and walls.
Okay.
But the Yactopata Sun Temple, the Sacred Plaza on Machu Picchu, and the river Intihuatana, which is down by the river in the base of the gorge below, all three are on the June solstice sunrise, December solstice sunset axis.
Oh, wonderful.
And at Yactopata, standing at the Sun Temple, the main door, if you will, for the Sun Temple has a stone channel built into the ground that points exactly at the Sacred Plaza at Machu Picchu across the gorge.
Which azimuth or orientation is Machu Picchu?
It's pointing along that axis of the June solstice sunrise, December solstice sunset, right at the Sacred Plaza in Machu Picchu.
Incredible.
But if you want to think about some of the same kind of ceremony going on to demonstrate significance with the sun, they could be pouring sacred fluid down that channel. The Incas believed that fluids brought life and sentience to so many different things. They could have been pouring a fluid down the channel to energize the sun to keep it from descending below the horizon as the June solstice approached, and then of course it worked. And for any of their subjects that were aware of the ceremony going on, it would show that yes, we are uh, honored by the sun, and we've done what we needed to do, and it's going back up again. That's just one hypothesis, but it's one that fits in with some of the other things that we've talked about.
You've just not been dramatic here and saying rewritten history, but what it does do is it kills all conceptions of Machu Picchu being one isolated royal estate, if you like. It's a much more expansive, memorialized landscape.
And that's what came out of this. It was a greater ceremonial complex. One of the ideas that Kim Melville hypothesized about was that the Inca himself, if he was there at Machu Picchu at the time of the solstice, or if he wasn't, perhaps another significant priest, could walk the Inca roads around from Machu Picchu to Yactopata. And Yactopata itself could have had gold plates on it, or the Inca could be wearing a big gold shield, and then the sun, as it rose, could shine off of this down onto Machu Picchu. And because of Kim's idea there, I staged a demonstration of that. I left one of my research assistants with a mirror up at Yactopata.
Did you?
And down at Machu Picchu by the sacred plaza, I watched for the reflection of the sun rising, and the sun, and the way this effect could have worked. I mean, this is all a hypothesis. There's nothing substantiating it, but
of course,
the mirror reflected the sunlight 37 minutes before the sun rose down below where we were at the sacred plaza. So if there was a ceremony going on, it would show the significance of what was happening at Yactopata before the sun actually rose at Machu Picchu, because it was, like I said, it was 37 minutes apart.
You're suggesting then that Machu Picchu was perhaps not a center. I mean, how many buildings were found at Machu Picchu compared to the 100 you found there?
Not as many, no. And then down in the river, in the gorge below, is the river Indihuatana, which has another finely carved stone with cosmological significance, the three steps and stuff like that. But there's a tower there. There's basins. There's a fountain. And because that was down by the river, not far from where they built the hydroelectric plant, it was long known that they were there, but people didn't understand why, what might have been the reason, what significance. But now Yactopata was found, and it started being realized about the larger ceremonial complex around that whole area. And then it turns out that the river Inihuatana is on that same axis for June solstice sunrise, December solstice sunset. And then Kim also hypothesized there's another axis coming from not the Sun Temple, but the Overlook Temple of Yactopata, crossing over the river Inihuatana in the gorge again, heading toward the Mount Machu Picchu. So there could have been another orientation there. And then, there's been those who have thought that some of these orientations could lend themselves to being sekes that were at Machu Picchu.
What a great segue, Stephen.
Right before we segue into that, I promised earlier I would quickly talk about the Pleiades and the Heliacal Rise.
In your own time, please, but you just segue from Pleiades to sekes.
And I saved that for Yactopata because there were alignments, orientations found there that were thought that could have been used again to watch the heliacal rise of the Pleiades, the first rise, visible rise after it's passed around the sun, to predict the season of crops. A dull appearance when it first could be seen foretold of good rains and a good season for crops, where a very clear appearance foretold of drought, which basically they were predicting the effects of an El Nino year. So talking about sekes,
yes, please.
And like I said, what's been now discovered around Machu Picchu lends itself to the possibility of sekes being there. But Polo de Ondegardo, the chronicler, had written from his interviews that there were sekes all over the empire, in many locations.
So describe what a seke is then, because to many a seke is a line, but are you saying there were many seke systems?
You have many Seke systems
Mm.
in different parts of the empire. So there was definitely the most famous one that Tom Zaidama, did published about extensively is the one of the Sekes in Cusco, and I'll talk more about those in just a minute. But Ondegardo wrote that there were Sekes elsewhere in the empire as well, Seke systems elsewhere in the empire. It's just that there hasn't been the same kind of evidence to be found yet, but other than what's in the chronicles. Of course, a lot of that because the Spaniards were bent on eradicating everything they could of the indigenous religion. For instance, they used the sun for calendrical purposes, and around Cusco could have been 16 towers or whatever, but they were set to mark certain times of the year when the sun rose with those towers.
From the Temple of the Sun.
Yes, from the Coricancha.
Hmm.
And of course, the Spaniards totally eradicated them. There's nothing left, no trace of them at all. But they did keep records of where they were because they wanted to go back and make sure that the Incas didn't try to rebuild. So we at least know that. Now, just before I get into the Sekes again, while I'm talking about the towers, on the north side of the Sacred Valley, near the modern village of Urubamba, was we had Pachacuti, then Topa Inca, then Huayna Capac was Pachacuti's grandson, who became the emperor when Topa Inca died. He built a temple called Kesvihuanca up by Urubamba, and among the other structures there in the center was a big sacred granite boulder. And at that focal point, there's a ridge up above, the Cerro Sewa Ridge, that has two towers on it that are still there. They were not destroyed by the Spaniards. And Kim and another one of his students started some research there, and I came in and finished some good photo documenting where the sun rises with those towers for the June solstice sunrise, and it wasn't where they were framing in the center where the sun was going to rise. The first tower on the right, as the sun was moving that way, was kind of a warning that it was coming, and then a few days before, and then it kept moving toward the left tower for the sunrise, and then of course after the standstill it moved back again. But I was able to photo document that, so and that helped to substantiate that this kind of astronomy was practiced with the towers that had been recorded in writing in Cusco.
How were these towers constructed, Stephen?
They were out of stone, but these weren't carved. They were more like stones that were cut a little more toward brick size and built that way. Although they were big bricks. The Incas were master stonemasons. Um, there's some very fine walls. Some of their walls are finer than others, but there's some very fine walls now that they built that they, even after all these years, you still can't pass a credit card between the stones. They used no mortar. It was just carved and fit together.
I was fortunate enough to spend 2 days at Sacsayhuaman, just to the
Yes,
north of Cusco, and
some wonderful rock work there.
beyond any particular stone, an archaeologist, Dr. Maria Sylvia, I believe her name was, she told me this, which has stuck with me for near 15 years. She's identified one rock and asked me to estimate how heavy I thought it was, and whatever the rock ended up being, it was somewhere in the region of 60 to 80 tons, this rock. And
Mhm.
she said there is a very strong local tradition that rocks such as that came from as far away as 60 kilometers. And she said that it might have been one whole clan's job for perhaps 5 or 6 generations to get their rock over, that landscape, over and around and up and down to the building of this future temple, or to be used in the new imperial center, if you like. And I just thought about everything altogether different then, what you can actually do with ropes and posts when you have a bunch of people managed and organized. And I thought that's maybe what's happening from what you said at the very beginning, Stephen, was that those two wackets you saw were perhaps taken to that site.
as large as it is more round and shaped a little bit more like a ball. So potentially it could have been moved
Mm.
if they were um, like this archaeologist you were talking to was saying,
Hmm.
had the ability to move massive rock like that.
Yeah. And she said it's you can tell because the geology of the rocks at Sacsayhuaman represent different areas of the Inca Empire. However, Stephen, let's use our last few moments to have you talk about the Seki system from the Coricancha. There's a key question I'd like to ask you, and I've had three different insights and opinions, and the question that I have to put to you that's really simple is the Cusco Seki system of alignments straight line to the horizon sighting lines, or zigzags connecting local shrines on loose alignments from a centre? Two completely different concepts. One, sight lines to the horizon, the others, localized lines that were connected up over time. What do you think?
And that's a good question to bring up because the original research of Tom Zeitema back in the early 60s was started out with his research for his PhD. And Tom was a mentor of mine and gave me some great insight when I was later doing my own research. His original thoughts were they were straight lines, but over the years, others and it's pretty much generally accepted, myself included, they're not straight lines. That they zigzag, and some try to argue that they never cross one another, although there's some dispute about that too.
Yeah.
But they're not straight, and they have each seke has multiple wakas on it, and the Panakas and the Ayus, the family groups of people, it's their path in life to care for the wakas and on the sekes, and there's different offerings and care and such that has to take place at different times, and of course there's other things going on that they need to do to feed themselves while they're employed caring for these. Some of them have very different significances of why they were there, what they meant to the empire, what they could be used for, what they might have foretold of. Some say that there could have been over 400 of them around Cusco at one time. 328 is more commonly accepted.
Okay. That's the number of days in a lunar year.
And then also the number of sekes. It's usually thought of as either 42 or 43. They go back and forth on that. And Tom Zeitema proposed a calendar that this could have been all a calendar system.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Brian Bauer and others disputed that, saying no, that's not true. And they kind of went, that hypothesis kind of faded over time that it was used as a calendar like that. But it was interesting thought at the time.
You brought up Tony Aveni there in an earlier interview. He said exactly as you've said. It was considered they were straight, but they're made up of zigzags. He accepts that. But he also just suggested he thinks the Inca priesthood perceived this as a straight system, a symbolically straight Seki system. And he also doubled down and says that he does believe it was used physically as a calendar, whereby the stages of the sun or the moon would be watched passing these sekis. My question is, if it was a straight line system, give me one example of one of the 41, 2 or 3 lines that has a waka terminating on the horizon, and there isn't one. And I think that's the best evidence to say that it wasn't a straight line to horizon system, because there isn't one waka on the horizon. You'd think there'd be several after what you've described, wouldn't you?
But you make a very good point. Mm-hmm.
The lack of evidence in this case is perhaps the best that there is available.
And Tony and Kim, not Tony and Kim, Tony and Tom did a lot of research and work together. So Tony Avini, he would have a, a very great feel for what he believes how the calendar would work.
I couldn't argue it when he was describing it. I just thought, oh my goodness, the guy's really got this down. That was my very first question episodes ago was this a functional system for monitoring passing time, or a symbolic system for statewide social control. They're quite different avenues of thought, aren't they?
Or a blend of both.
Oh, there you go. There's me trying to get all dualistic again. And also where I've been years thinking about how could you possibly walk down a Secchi line and you'd maybe find some cases 4 or some cases 8 stones or springs or caves. I thought, how could you have an astronomical system functioning within a landscape that's so changeable and variable? But then Tony said something and it really did line me up. He said that perhaps from one waka you wouldn't be looking at the next waka on your line for the astronomical significance. It would be looking across to perhaps a waka on another line or 2 lines adjacent.
I wish they had kept written record.
Stephen, we've talked about the Secchi lines, we talked about Machu Picchu, and we went all the way back there to the shadows of Inca astronomy. Is there anything else you think you'd like to mention or bring up that would be nice to add into our chat?
I think that's some great food for thought that we've touched on today.
Superb. Stephen, thank you so much for your time and for coming on, talking about the Incas. It's been fascinating.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it.